Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. This is John with Murder by the Book. We're really excited tonight to bring you another virtual event. Tonight, we're going to be chatting with Emily Schultz, who her new book, Little Threats, is out. She is the co-founder of the influential Joyland magazine and the author of The Blondes, an international bestseller named a Best Book of 2015 by NPR, BookPage, and Kirkus Reviews. Her writing has appeared in Elle, Slate, Evergreen Review, Vice, Hazlitt, and the Prairie Schooner. Currently a producer at an indie media company, Heroic Collective. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and son. How are you tonight, Emily?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me, John.
Oh, my pleasure. We're so excited for this. So your book, Little Threats, just came out Tuesday. Is that correct?
Yeah, it just came out. It looks like that. And it's been crazy. I've been doing all kinds of things. I'm sure Halley has been too, and it's been a lot of fun.
Awesome. And so we're also joined by Halley Sutton, whose book, The Lady Upstairs, actually comes out next Tuesday. Is that correct?
Next Tuesday, that's right. But I have an early copy here.
Awesome. And so you can, if you guys are watching, you'll be able to, you can pre-order a copy and we'll have it ready for you next Wednesday. Halley is a writer and editor who lives in Los Angeles. She's a Pitch Wars mentor and holds a master's degree in writing from Otis College of Art and Design. The Lady Upstairs is her debut novel. How are you tonight, Halley?
I'm doing so well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to join you both.
My pleasure. So Halley was just telling us before we got started that this is her first book event that she's done. So we're so excited to be kind of part of your publishing journey and be able to host you for your first event. I'm going to let the two of them chat for a little bit. So if you guys are watching live on YouTube, if you have questions for either author, drop those in the comments in YouTube. I'm going to let them chat for a little bit and then I will pop back in later and I will relay any of your questions that have popped up. So I'm going to turn it over to y'all and I will see you in a little bit.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So Emily, congratulations on the publication of Little Threats, which was a novel I loved. Can you share a little bit about what the book is about?
Yeah, thanks, Halley. Just the rundown is it's about identical twin sisters, and one of them has done 14 years in prison for a crime that she may or may not have committed, and now she's getting back out into the world, and she herself is not entirely sure whether she actually did murder her best friend or not, and she has to come to terms with her twin sister, who still doesn't trust her and is a little standoffish, and just kind of integrate into society again.
Wonderful. And I loved this book. It's such a beautiful, chewy literary thriller mystery exploration of character. Just beautiful book.
Oh, thank you. And I felt the same way about The Lady Upstairs. I actually feel like I have a lot of things to ask you about it. But the thing about Halley's book, The Lady Upstairs, is there is this unique job situation. And I think you have to tell us about that.
Yes. So The Lady Upstairs is a modern feminist noir about women who run a blackmail agency in Los Angeles, targeting bad men, like Harvey Weinstein bad would be an example. And when the book opens, our main character, Jo, is right in the middle of a sting operation with a young woman who she has sent after, essentially a Harvey Weinstein type casting couch king. And there's a lot riding on this job for Jo. It is not only a big fish for her to get personally, but also if she gets the job cleared, she will no longer be in debt to her mysterious employer, the Lady Upstairs.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask you about. Can you tell us more about this mysterious employer? So, I mean, she's doing all this kind of dirty work, and it's intense. And who is the Lady Upstairs, or do we find out?
We do find out who the Lady Upstairs is eventually. But, it was kind of an idea that came to me when I wanted to write a book that was a noir, that I wanted to create this kind of almost female mob boss that was, typically those roles are so often filled by men, this kind of like top-down organization. And I was like, well, what if it's a woman? And what if she has this kind of vengeance vendetta going on? So that's kind of where that idea came from.
Yeah, I was thinking about this actually, as we both kind of have these tough women.
Yes.
In unexpected situations. Like I have Kennedy and she's done time in prison, and you have Jo who's involved with this,
a tough cookie, Jo.
Exactly. She's very tough.
What about, so for you writing Kennedy, who is tough, and I think what's so interesting about Kennedy is that she there's these dual narratives in your book between Kennedy after she's gotten out of prison and then the flashbacks that we see going into what has actually happened to her friend Haley, who is the dead girl kind of at the center of the story. So I'm curious about the experience of kind of writing both sides of this tough woman that, the 16-year-old who's got the 16-year-old attitude, and then the hardened woman who's gotten out of jail.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I wanted to have this time jump, because the crime is set in 1993 and she is just a teenager, they're all just teenagers, her sister, their friend, and they're girls experimenting, and they're really innocent in a way. Even though they're doing these wild things, they're, it's the 90s and they're dropping LSD and smoking pot and, sneaking into concerts and things like that, and going to college parties that they shouldn't go to, and sleeping with boys. But at the same time, there's an innocence there. And then I wanted to kind of fast forward, and what happens once you're an adult and once you're a woman and you have a different perspective on all of those things. And the naivety is gone, right? There is a loss of innocence, which also, I was reading The Lady Upstairs and I was feeling like there's in some ways a loss of innocence here too. There's a loss of trust as you start to build these relationships with people who, she's deceiving. But yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I had one reviewer who talked about that basically all of Jo's relationships are false, except for the central relationship to her coworker and her best friend and the woman who kind of got her involved in this blackmail agency, Lou. And I don't think that that's wrong. I think that Jo is a character who, kind of is trying to reject all types of feelings, but of course that never works. And it's not an interesting character if you are totally unfeeling, but that's kind of the armor that she's wearing that gets peeled back as the novel goes on.
Yeah, I think armor is a really good word. And Kennedy has an armor too. One of the reasons I wrote the book is because I did want to write about identical twins. I have brothers who are twins. I don't know if either of them are watching. If they are, hello, thank you for coming.
They better be.
But, I wanted to write about identical twins for that reason, is because they're people who are very similar and then also very different. And in this case, it's it's obviously a fictional story. Neither of my brothers were ever involved in a crime.
Disclaimer.
But Kennedy has certainly built up an armor, just like Jo, from her time in prison and also her time going through, the trial and the pretrial. She takes a plea deal. She pleads. She does an Alford plea. She doesn't know exactly what that means because she's young. She's a child. There are all these lawyers around her, and they say, you kind of have to, say that. You'll admit to it, but you also assert your innocence and go away and do 15 years, 14 years instead of doing a life sentence for murder. And so she does.
And I thought that was, so interesting talking about the Kennedy and Carter as identical twins. It seems to me that part of what I found so powerful about your book is the way that Kennedy is haunted by so many different ghosts. There's the ghost of Haley, her friend, but there's also when she gets out of jail, she comes back to her childhood bedroom. So she's haunted by the ghost of herself. Then there's this example of her sister who, obviously has been deeply affected by the murder and the trial and everything too, but is kind of another parallel mirror of what she could have been or what didn't happen there. And you did that so well. I'm curious about the process of that a little bit.
Oh, thank you. It's I wanted to look at the family home, and so this is set in a fictional suburb of Richmond, Virginia, which of course is a real place that I lived after college and where I still have family. And I wanted to look at suburbs in general. The McMansion was so popular. Is still popular, but was so popular in the 80s and the 90s. And so I wanted to look at this family home as being like a place that could be really oppressive and almost like a Gothic mansion or something like a manse. And she comes back to the family home and she's sort of pigeonholed into this role and identity of being her teenage self again. A little bit like in the movie Rebecca, where, she moves into her husband's house and then she's sort of haunted by, the first Mrs. De Winter. And she has all these expectations put on her that are not necessarily what she would choose.
Right.
But, something that I was thinking about is both of us have these really intense settings, and your book also really plays on the setting in terms of LA and what it means to be drawn into LA, and this the circle of fame, you know what I mean? And they're trying to bring down these famous men. And I know that you were writing it, I think you said to me before, as you moved to LA, is that right?
Yes, I had the thing that started with the book for me, kind of that started me on writing this book, was Jo's voice. I had this really strong voice of this character in my head, and I kept trying to put her in different things, and it didn't really work because nothing felt big enough for her. And then when I moved to Los Angeles for grad school, it kind of clicked that maybe this was a noir. And I was really interested in, I didn't know much about LA before I moved here. I'd been here, but I didn't really understand it as a city. It's a very strange city. It was never really city planned. It's like half mythology, but half very real. And so I was really interested in kind of Los Angeles as this ever-shifting place, which I think was kind of what I was trying to do with the novel, and kind of this mythological place where you can build this kind of version of yourself that maybe you can't do in other cities. You can kind of come to LA and become a mirage, if you will, which is kind of what Jo does.
Did you become a mirage when you moved to LA?
No, I would say I got more real, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's really interesting that you didn't necessarily know that it was going to be a noir, because the tone of your novel is very noir. You have these wonderful descriptions. Like, I think when we first meet Lou, you describe her as being like warmed chocolate or something like that. Like, there are just these wonderful character descriptions. And so I'm surprised. And there's also a lot of bars, a lot of dark bars.
A lot of dark bars.
A lot of drinking.
Had to do a lot of research. Yeah, thank you. I had always loved noir and had always loved murder, which is a strange thing to say, but maybe not for this crowd. Murder by the Book crowd, probably people feel me. But it kind of clicked in this weird way. And then I just kind of like immersed myself in a ton of noir literature and films to kind of get that tone right. Because you want to pay homage to the genre without coming off as like a low rent Raymond Chandler. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's a fine line to walk, and I'm not sure.
You don't.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. What about you? Something that I found so interesting about your book is the 90s setting, which I did live through, but probably had a very different experience. I had a very different experience than Kennedy. So I'm curious about, how did you kind of bring that? It feels you find such specific details that really evoke an era. And what I would say too is that it didn't feel like, I think that you can look back on the 90s and have this kind of idea of what the 90s were, but you're like, the way that you evoked it felt much more real and true. So I'm curious about how you kind of achieved that without a time machine.
I'm old enough to remember all of it. In stunning detail, in spite of the pot that might have been smoked at that time in my life, I can still remember it all very clearly. And I listened to a lot of music while I was writing this. I went back and listened to a lot of Radiohead and L7 and Sonic Youth and the Pixies and Belly, and you know what I mean? So that part was fun. It was really fun to go back into 90s music. And, that's not exactly research because I remember most of it. There are some things that I had to, rely on my copy editor, and they would say, this album didn't come out for 3 more months. You set this firmly. The crime takes place July 4th, 1993. So I don't think we can have this reference.
Right.
And then I would argue a little bit. I'd be like, well, actually, Kurt Cobain played that song in concert and they could have known it. And, things like that.
I love that you know that much detail about it. But yeah, God bless copy editors.
Yeah, but I mean, I really did want to explore the 90s, partly because I wanted to look at what crime was like, as DNA sampling and whatnot and testing was just getting going, and a lot of people didn't know what it was. We didn't have cameras everywhere. We didn't have vast digital footprints that we left behind, which meant that committing a crime was quite a bit easier.
Right.
And then to come forward into 2008, which is when Kennedy is released from prison, and there's a crime show host on a television show who's, she's exploring it. Oh, you're frozen. Am I frozen too?
Oh, I think, yeah. Oh, we're back. Okay.
Could you hear me? Was I frozen?
I heard you say that I was frozen, and then I lost you.
Okay, well, I'll try to be simpler.
2008, you were talking about the crime show host.
Yeah, so then I wanted to come forward to 2008, and we have this crime show host, and she's sort of re-exploring the case. and she wants to do it as an episode. And so all of these people are telling their stories again, and new evidence is coming to light because now we have the technology for it. And I mean, but I also wanted to look at what changed between 1993 and 2008, and then hoping that the reader will look at what's changed from 2008 until now.
Right. And I think you do that so well. And actually that leads me into a question, which was that the only other time I think I've heard of the Alford plea being used, I know it's been used before, but I think one of the more famous cases was the West Memphis 3, if I'm correct. Do you remember that?
I don't know, actually.
Okay. Well, I was curious.
Look it up.
I guess I was just curious about what was your inspiration behind that. I mean, I guess that kind of shades the line between, Kennedy not knowing her guilt or not. And was that kind of what pushed you in that direction?
Yeah, it was basically because I wanted it to be, they thought that they would continue to fight for her innocence and do appeals. And yet she would plead to the crime. And I wanted to look at also like how many crimes are just pleas, and they don't actually go to trial, even in very, violent cases. So that was a way to do that.
What did you find out?
What did you find out? Most of them don't go to trial. I mean, because it would take so much time. People are often forced to plea or pressured to plea.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about the publishing journey. So you mentioned before that your inspiration for Kennedy and Carter was, your own family history of twins a little bit, but I would love to, what kind of was the thing that hooked you into this novel besides that?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, in addition to having brothers who are identical twins, I also have several sets of friends, close friends who are identical twins. And I just find it really interesting. The idea that, so one of my friends told me that when their sibling does something terrible, they feel like they're also responsible because they feel like everyone in the world will see them as being responsible. So
interesting.
Things like that. Or, I'm going to get in trouble from my brothers for saying this, but I think that one of them has said before that there's no point in arguing with the other because they know what they'll say in response. So it's kind of like talking to yourself.
How interesting.
Yeah. But I mean, I guess the other thing that really hooked me into it was I wanted to show what happens to victims and their families, or everyone really involved in a crime, like even the sister of someone who's considered a criminal, and what their lives are like after, and especially long after, when we lose somebody, whether it's, through violence or through an accident, it stays, right? That grief stays and your life changes, and the patterns that you take and the ways that you go in your life changes. And so I kind of wanted to look at that too. It's funny that you said you didn't know your book was going to be a noir, because I don't know if I knew my book was going to be like a mystery or a thriller, like that.
Oh, interesting.
Kind of crept in. I think it was more like a literary concept. And then the next thing I knew, I was like, well, what if she didn't commit the crime? And what if people don't know? And what if they're trying to figure it out? And then suddenly it was like, well, if she didn't, then who did? And they're still out there. And then there's a threat, right?
Right. And then when you wite the crime novel and you pose that question, you have to answer it. So
exactly. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Then you've got some work to do.
Right. That's the tricky part.
So tell me how what was your journey with the book? Because I know you did this thing called Pitch Wars.
Yes.
And you were basically, were you saying the novel aloud before you had it written, or you had written it already and you were pitching it to agents?
So Pitch Wars is this online mentoring program that happens every year, and it's people donate their time. So it's published authors or professional editors, or I think even maybe for a while they had agents who would do it, and you would sign up to be a mentor, and people apply with a manuscript that needs work but should be like a completed manuscript, if you get picked out of the slush bucket, then you work with your mentor for 3 to 4 months. And then at the end, there is this agent showcase where basically it's like you get to share your first page, a pitch, and like a short query letter, and agents get to look at it, which is like a huge boost up if you're querying, because it is hard to make it out of the slush pile. So it's really nice to get that. So for me, I had written the first draft of my book while I was in grad school, and I think I had a really strong concept, and I had a strong sense of Joe and not a lot of plot. And so I was querying the novel and getting getting a lot of very kind rejections, and I got the kindest rejection in the world from Sharon Pelletier, who is now my agent, where she gave me a bunch of feedback, which was so nice. It was like a lifeline in the dark when you're just kind of sitting there going like, why does no one like my book? And she had these like paragraphs of feedback about it, which kind of pointed me in the direction of revising it and pointed me in the direction of Pitch Wars. So I actually got picked by a woman named Elaine Fargo, who is a feminist thriller writer. She has 2 books out, Temper and They Never Learn, and they're both fabulous. And she really helped me revise in those 3 to 4 months significantly. This was in 2018, the plot of my novel. I remember one of her biggest notes was that my midpoint was in the wrong place. And I was like, that sounds great. I don't know what a midpoint is. Let's figure it out. So we really, during that time, kind of took this idea that I had in my draft and really kind of just made like a much more narrative arc to it. And then after that, I actually ended up signing with Sharon, which was fabulous. And she's the best agent in the world. I'm biased, and she might be listening. So, and then revised with her, and then we sold the book to Putnam and revised some more. And it, I think that's one of the things that I have been most surprised at, but in a good way. Like if you had told me 3 years ago how much revision I was going to do on this book, I would not have believed you.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah.
This was, my editor is also your editor, I think.
Yes.
Danielle Dietrich, and she was amazing.
Amazing. Fabulous.
And
such a great editorial eye.
One of the things that she did that was so helpful is she made a list of my physical evidence involved in the murder.
Oh,
and she said,
yes.
Here's where you have it. You have it all in the back half of the book. So for anyone who's picking up this book wanting a mystery, you need to spread this out.
That is like such a helpful note.
Yeah. And
also
it was really helpful because there were things that I didn't even consider as being evidence that were,
right.
Pieces of the puzzle.
Right. So. Was that hard to kind of thread that through? That's something I'm always really interested in talking with other writers about, is like, it's such a fine balance between, you want the ending to be a surprise, like in a crime novel or, anything that has a central mystery, but at the same time, it has to feel earned. So I'm curious about how you guys went about kind of deciding that in the revision, with how to plant clues and where.
It was hard because, the ending, I knew what I wanted that to be. A lot of times I write really intuitively and I don't quite know where I'm going. I'm just kind of following the characters to see where they take me and how they react to a given situation and how their relationships develop. But I did know what I wanted the ending to be. And the question was, how far from the end, like how many pages from the end, should we find out who committed the crime, who murdered this beautiful teenage girl that was their friend, Haley. And I was like, we need to have enough following resolution, you know what I mean? The character relationships have to be there at the end. So it was a real struggle to know, like, how close do you plant it, so it's not it's not in the last 2 pages of this book. You will find out, and then there's more to come, and you're like, how can there still be more? But but I also didn't want to give it away too soon, as you say.
And I think with your book in particular, without giving anything away, I think you hit the exact sweet spot, because like you say, it's so much about the relationship. So understanding how the revelation impacts all of those relationships is like as important as the reveal itself, in my opinion.
Oh, thank you. Something that we also share, and I think we should talk about this just for like a second, and then we probably need to do a reading, both of us.
Probably. I'm having too much fun talking to you.
I know. But one thing that I was thinking about is how both of us have these sort of trio relationships in the book. So in my book, I have the twins and their friend. And then there's also an older boyfriend that, is hanging around with these young girls. And so there's like a trio relationship between Kennedy and her best friend, Haley, who winds up murdered in the woods, and this older boy, Burke Butler. And in your book, you have like a trio relationship. There's the photographer who's trying to catch these men in the act.
Yes.
And then you've got Joe, who's your lead character. And then you have this other woman in the operation who's like a best friend, but there's also, there's some attraction between everybody, and her name is Lou.
Yes.
And I wondered, like, if you want to talk about that. And then I think because we're talking about the characters, maybe we should both read so that people can get an idea.
That sounds great. Yeah. It was something that I kind of consciously wanted to write in there, so much of the book for me was about Joe Jo's heart, which is like a strange thing to say because when you first meet her, she's very cynical and very sarcastic and is trying to be this very hardened woman. But I was kind of trying to show the way that her connection in these relationships pops up. And she has very different connections to both of these people. There's Robert Jackal, who is the photographer and he's kind of also the muscle for the operation, and they've been sleeping together and it's pretty casual, but they're probably more connected than they actually want to talk about. And then there's Lou, who really is like, the reason that Jo is still, besides the debt that she owes the boss, it really is Lou that keeps her in here. Lou is kind of the person who makes her center and her heart. And
they're like best friends with an attraction as well.
Yes, definitely. Best friends. Jo is attracted to both Robert the man and Lou the woman in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that's very similar to my book with Haley and Kennedy,
Mm-hmm.
and also Burke.
Right. And I think you do that really well too with the kind of triangle happening there and the way that the girls are, that kind of really impassioned 16-year-old best friend love where you're almost trying to step into each other's skins. And
it is, right?
Yeah.
And they all start to dress alike, the girls
Right.
are dressing like one another. They're dressing Haley up in Doc Martens
Mm-hmm.
and,
Yeah, and that's really beautifully done.
So who wants to read first, you or me? Do you have a section?
I'll go first.
Okay, great.
I'll let you back clean up. Okay, so I'm just going to read from the beginning of my book, the first chapter, just a few pages. So I'd picked the hotel for the Sting because the bar had one hell of a happy hour. If you liked your drinks cheap and strong, the glasses washed maybe once in the last week. It was down the street from the studios, the right type of place to entice a movie man to meet an obliging blonde for a quick afternoon pick-me-up. And not the least of my calculations, the St. Leo let me have my choice of adjoining rooms whenever I checked in, and didn't mind early arrangements or a quick redecoration for the right price. By my second drink, the apricot-tinted windows were purpling with twilight, happening so early these days, turning the light in the bar a good soft color for sloppy bad decisions. I was waiting on my third when I saw Ellen escorting the Mark through the lobby to the elevator. She stayed cool, didn't toss me so much as a backward glance. It was harder to do than it looked. But Ellen kept her eyes firmly on the Mark's face, fingers curled around the patched elbow of his tweed blazer, a gift from one of his grandkids, no doubt, or one of the grown children benefiting from his production company's rampant nepotism. When I'd researched him for Lou and our shadowy employer, the lady upstairs, it had been one of the things that sold me. He kept his grabby sons on set, even after numerous complaints had been filed. I'd read that and thought, this one's perfect. He looked at me, a swoop of terror in my stomach, but it was no more than the passing glance of a man surveying the room. I met his eyes and looked away without smiling, letting my gaze go through him. Once they got upstairs, showtime. Even on a Saturday afternoon, prime drinking hours, the bar was nearly empty. It was big business when a couple sat down by the windows, and I watched them as I waited for the Mark to reappear, distracting myself. Her long, honey-brown hair was ironed straight and scissored over her face, while his fingers plucked at the neck of his sweat-splotched shirt. They ignored each other and the fact that neither one of them was having any fun. She'd ordered something clear, vodka soda, I bet, unfussy and low-calorie. See how low maintenance I am? And watched it melt all over her napkin. They hadn't slept together yet, I was positive. Perhaps tonight was the night. Another bet, between the heat and the poor hotel accommodations and the fact that they were working hard to ignore each other, it wouldn't be a night to remember. Making up stories about strangers is not usually in my nature. Relax, Jo, would ya? Robert Jackal had said that morning, buttoning his shirt collar and steadying himself in my bathroom mirror. Eyelashes longer than any woman's, but that was the only thing womanly at all about that carved, handsome face. Eyes pure, no hazel green, dark hair in disarray like a sleepy boy's, crunchy between my fingers. It's not like you to be nervous. Even before the sun was up, my walls sweated little beads of condensation. I was enjoying the coolness of the pillow against my cheek, starfishing my limbs and trying to find some chill in the spot he'd left. I didn't answer him. By the time I'm done, we'll have so much footage we won't know what to do with it all, he said, then bent down to kiss me on the forehead, reaching down to tap his fingers against the bracelet he'd given me as a birthday present a few years back, a mistake he hadn't repeated since. I'd slapped his face away. As I waited, I piled my fleshless lime rinds into dimpled green pyramids, keeping the trash to mark time, how many drinks I'd had, keeping my fingers busy so I wouldn't start doing algebra about Klein's net worth on the bar top. 326 million meant he'd pay how much for photographs of his nasty predilections? What about for a video? 6 blockbusters scheduled to come out in the next year meant a reputation was worth how much exactly? 50 grand? More? My 20% of 50 grand would just about do it. Calm down, I told myself. In less than an hour, you'll have the prince. And this time tomorrow, or the day after, say, you'll have what you owe to the lady upstairs. And I'll leave us there.
It's fantastic. I love that.
Thank you.
That was a great ending, too. Like, that's such a perfect section. Just enough of a taste.
A little teaser. Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do actually a scene with Burke Butler, who's the older boy. I know. You're not going to get to meet Kennedy tonight. You're going to have to hide
goodness.
the book. I know. What am I doing? I'm going rogue. So you're going to meet Burke Butler and the woman Dee Nash, who's on the crime television show, who's trying to convince everybody throughout the book to talk to the television producers and see if she can make a show out of this.
Wonderful.
Burke Butler was never on time for work, but that day he was meeting with someone from TV. He parked outside the grocery store that bore his surname, looked in the rear view, licked his fingers, and smoothed his thick eyebrows. With his hair gone, it was the last thing on his body he could remotely style. He entered through the automatic doors and went to the office, though he mostly worked on the loading dock and only sometimes floor managed, taking care of cider displays, samples, and banners. "Come on, everyone, push them apples," his younger brother Wyatt said whenever he did a walkthrough at the store, their flagship and one of 24 in the state. With each repeated instruction about fruit sales from his boss, Burke imagined Sisyphus pushing a giant soul-crushing apple up the hill. He wanted Dee Nash, the host of Crime After Crime, to see him in the office. Wyatt was at the store only a couple hours a day and would never know Burke had passed off this desk as his own. As he waited, he played with his tie, which the younger guys had already teased him about. Dee Nash was punctual. At 5 minutes to 1 o'clock, he saw her arrive on one of his brother's monitors. A black woman in a well-tailored pantsuit, she moved with a cop's authority past the registers and inquired with the floor manager. Burke drew some papers to himself and picked up a pen as she entered the office. He had no idea what he was signing so intently when he looked back up. "Mr. Butler?" "Detective?" "Former detective. So it's just Dee now." He'd watched one episode of Dee Nash's show. It began with a young woman, unmoving in a pool of blood, the kind of image he would switch off if he could. The camera angle cut to the victim's eye view, and then they showed Dee Nash walking across a gritty parking lot toward the camera, police tape blowing in the wind. "I lost my sister to violence when I was just 10. That's when I knew I had to dedicate my life to helping other victims. Time doesn't heal wounds. Justice does." The phone on the desk began lighting up, and Burke realized he didn't have a plan for that. He let it ring. "Berkeley," Dee began. "I don't believe in a lot of small talk." She glanced at the blinking phone lines. "And I can see you're a busy man. 24 stores I run, failing or succeeding because of decisions I make every day. Lucky I even get to see my little girl at night." He asked how old his little girl was, and Burke said 4, born after he'd met his wife, Serenity, and they'd wed in Vegas. His daughter was the best thing that had ever happened to him. "We do it all for them, don't we?" she said. "Sure as money is money." Burke leaned back in the chair almost too far. "Of course, and I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us about going on camera," Dee said. He leaned forward in the executive chair. "So how much does this pay?" "Oh, I'm sorry if there was any confusion. We don't pay interview subjects." Burke made a sound like she'd slugged him in the gut. "Then I'm wondering what it is I can do for you. My memory may not be so fresh." "You have a very personal interest in telling your story. You were closest to Haley Ray Kimberson." Hearing her full name was like being accused of things all over again. "I wouldn't say close. I'm not concerned about the age difference. Those were different times." Dee set her bag on the floor. She took out a small notebook. "I'd feel more comfortable without that," Burke said, shifting in his brother's chair. "My words got used against me before." Dee put the pen down. "Old cop habit. And after what they put you through, I should have known. A good man like yourself never got to tell your story to a jury?" Burke nodded at the flattery. "So what would you say was most important if you were trying to explain to someone who'd never heard of Haley Kimberson or you or Kennedy Wynn? What would you tell them?" Burke had brought a Polaroid of Haley with him to work that morning, like a talisman. It was from the moment she'd walked into his off-campus apartment only a couple weeks before she died. He'd tugged it out from hiding spots and looked at it over the years. It didn't quite capture how she could see right through his bullshit, that she knew his knowledge of philosophy and world religions would not stand up against the most basic interrogation, or that he never read the books stacked on his floor in his bedroom. Haley, full cheeks, light freckles, white tank top, necklace at her throat, red hair spilling from a sloppy bun. The only part of Kennedy in this photo was her hand on Haley's upper arm. When he'd put it in his pocket that morning, he didn't know if he would show it to Dee or if he just wanted it near him. His fingers grazed its edge. Then he took it away and put his hand back on the desk. It felt too intimate. I can see you're still a little hesitant, but I flew from Los Angeles just so we could talk. I hope that shows my commitment to sharing the truth, Dee said. He scoffed. Hesitant? No, I was just thinking things through. That's what bosses do. The phone began ringing again. You do know Kennedy Wynn was released today. We filmed her being picked up by her family, Dee said. That today? Didn't write it down in my daybook, I guess. Burke smirked. Dee reached down into her bag and pulled out a camcorder, not much bigger than a pear. She set it on the desk in front of her, flipped the screen, and offered to play the video for him. He could feel himself sweating through the collared shirt he wasn't used to. Are you going to talk to Kennedy? We'll talk to anyone involved who wants to tell their story. That's why it's important to tell yours. Burke thought about what Kennedy would say about that summer, all the lies coming back. Maybe this hadn't been a good idea. This is going to be like a documentary, right? Not an investigation? Well, we have some questions that we think weren't asked at the time. What questions? Haley was stabbed 19 times, 3 of her ribs broken. Her voice was flat as she recited the facts. Was Kennedy a strong girl? Tall? Maybe our height? 5'3", he thought. 5'4", maybe. Burke tried to remember, then realized where Dee was steering the conversation. Not so tall, no. Those are the kinds of questions we'll ask. Questions about height and other things. Dee took out her notebook again and scribbled. When Burke glanced across to see, he thought he read, Little White Vampire Girl, not tall, though it was hard to tell from his side of the desk. The office door opened. It was Liam, one of the stock boys. Hey, Burkoff, what are you doing in Wyatt's office? Having a meeting, can't you see that? And this is a shared office. Your wife's on the phone, Liam said. Liam left, and as Burke picked up the receiver, he glanced at Dee. She held onto her notepad as if to say she would wait. Burke punched the line, and the full force of Serenity's voice hit him. Are you an idiot? You're meeting with one of those crime show people, aren't you? We can talk about this later. Dee heard the other side of the call, or at least she could read Burke's shame. She gathered her things and slid a business card across the desk to him, excusing herself silently. Stop talking, Serenity commanded him. Go phone your dad now. Get a lawyer. Jesus Christ, Burke. Leave the past in the past.
Such a great scene. Such a great scene. And I remember when I read this too, when you watch those true crime shows, you're often like, who are the people who talk to to these people? And they're Burke. And I love that his wife is just like, no. Yeah. So great. Yeah. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, do we have time to keep talking before we have to go to questions? Let's just do it until John interrupts us.
That sounds good.
Okay.
So I was going to kind of pick up, you mentioned this a little bit. We kind of started talking a little bit about the relationships going forward, but in that scene, you drop a couple of, or in the central relationships, you drop a few clues that are important to the narrative, which is that Burke is kind of involved with a couple of the young women, and that there's also a significant age difference between Burke, at least significant in, there's a world of difference between 20 and 16 that may not be apparent between 30 and 34. So,
oh, for sure.
Right.
And that was something really that prompted the book as well, and really made me write it, and really made me write it fast. Is Me Too was happening. It was 2017, and I think all of us were looking back at our relationships in our lives, whether they're work relationships or personal relationships. And I was thinking back to the relationship I had when I was 16 with a boy who was 21, and as soon as I realized I was going to bring a character like that into the narrative, the narrative really took off, and I understood who the girls were and what their conflicts were, which was that there's something much outside of their understanding, really, because they're just children in a way. They're young and naive, and he is someone who's preying on them, even if he's only a handful of years older. So once I knew that, the narrative just kept spinning, basically. And I wanted to ask you about the same thing too. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of Me Too in your book.
There is.
I don't know if you want to define it that way or not, but
I think it's kind of impossible to not talk about it in terms of Me Too, partially because I was writing it at the same time, 2016, 17, 2018, when the Me Too movement was really publicized and large, even if it had started years before. But what's funny is that the Harvey Weinstein stuff broke when I already had a significant chunk of the book written. So it wasn't, there's the character that you kind of see a little bit in that part that I wrote that's this big producer that Joe's trying to kind of topple, named Hiram Klein. And he wasn't at first directly based on Harvey Weinstein, because the thing that's horrible, which is the Me Too movement is so important, but it just is that, like, everybody knew about Harvey Weinstein before we knew about Harvey Weinstein. Whether or not you knew it was Harvey Weinstein or not, we've had the casting couch directors around for as long as we've had casting couches. So it was just something that it was like, I know this is a rumor, I know this is a thing. And I think that that's kind of a lot of the men that Joe and Lou are working on for The Lady Upstairs are these bad men in power, which is not something that started in 2016, So I'm hoping that it maybe reflects a lot of the issues brought up in Me Too, but it wasn't necessarily written in response to that.
Yeah, and something else is, I think both of us were striving really to let our characters have a sexuality outside of that, and to not judge them too much for their sexuality. I mean, I was feeling that when I was reading your book, and I know it was something I was definitely trying to do.
Definitely. Yeah. Joe and Lou are both very fluid in the book, and it's kind of never really something that I specifically define. I never say Joe never says outright I'm bisexual. It's just she's drawn to who she's drawn to. And I was trying not to necessarily lean too heavily on that, the same way I was trying not to stigmatize the work that they're doing, which essentially is sex work, that, that they're training these women to seduce men for a pay cut. So, but very similar with you, I don't think you come down. I mean, I love that little tweak that Dee Nash has in that scene that you wrote where she says, oh, it was a different time. And you can tell that she's trying to get him to kind of
to talk and open up.
Right.
Trust her.
Right.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's such a nice, subtle signal to the reader. Like, we know this is not right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see John's with us. John, are you going to jump in with us?
Yes. So if you guys are watching live on Facebook, so you guys, the chat with Halley and Emily has been fantastic. Apparently all of YouTube is down. So I don't know. So we're actually streaming live on Facebook right now. I don't know at what point the YouTube stream stopped.
It'll go up.
Before we
Okay.
jump over. But I've been recording the whole chat. So if you guys came in late and missed the first part of it, we are recording it, so we will get it uploaded to the store's YouTube channel in the next day or two when YouTube is cooperating. A huge thank you to Alora, the publicist, who texted and said, because we already knew there were issues, but she texted and she was like, hey, and I was like, oh, we're over on Facebook. She's like, well, apparently all of YouTube is down. So that makes me feel better that it wasn't like, I was like, I don't know what's going on here. But so if you guys missed the first part of the chat, we're so sorry for the tech issues. Welcome to the fun world of virtual events, but we will get everything uploaded if you all missed any part of the chat. But so I do have some questions for the two of you. To start with, can y'all talk a little bit about who some of your influences were reading growing up? Was it crime fiction? Was it not crime fiction? Let's start with Halley.
Okay. I read across the board growing up. One of my favorite book series was the Ruby and the Smoke series by Philip Pullman. And I used to write letters to Sally Lockhart, who was the main character in there. And I don't think I mailed them, thank goodness. But as I've gotten older, Megan Abbott for me is like a huge influence. I think she's just fabulous. Laura Lippman, Vicki Hendricks, Todd Goldberg, Elmore Leonard. So a lot of those crime fiction, and people particularly like Emily, who kind of straddled the literary fiction, but also with the element of the crime fiction and the central mystery.
And how about you, Emily?
So I'm texting my partner to tell him this so he can let anyone know on my social that
Okay.
we're going to record this and put it up again. So like Halley, I read fairly widely as well. I actually really loved poetry. I wanted to be a poet. I love short fiction. This is why I started a short fiction magazine years ago. So really, like, my influences are all over the place. And in terms of crime, I'm really actually more interested in true crime. So when I was writing this, I was watching a lot of Investigation Discovery, which is how the crime show element came into it. In part because I often have a very emotional response to those shows. I wind up being really moved by the people who are speaking to the hosts and who are left behind. And there were also a lot of cases that I followed really closely that I just became captivated by and fascinated by, and especially ones involving girls. You know, and they didn't influence this book directly, but I mean, just reading about them and especially ones involving girls, you know, like the Slender Man case, for instance. Or I thought it was really interesting with Michelle McNamara's book, how that actually led to the arrest of the Golden State Killer and years later, things like that. But I mean, in terms of my influences, really, I love a good literary novel. I love short fiction, and I still love reading poetry.
So I had a request to reintroduce her. We were talking with Emily Schultz, whose book Little Threats has just come out on Tuesday. And we're also talking with Halley Sutton, whose debut novel, The Lady Upstairs, will be out next Tuesday. So you guys can have them available, or we'll have them available at Murder by the Book, so you can order them through us, or pre-order, as it were. And so we had a question from Michelle. She wants to know what research is involved in your writing. Is there travel involved? Do you read other authors kind of as research? Let's start with Emily this time.
The 90s, I lived through it, as I said. So, I mean, all of that just came out of my own experience. In terms of, I mean, knowing about prison life, I have an aunt who taught literacy for decades in Virginia prisons. And I have another brother who's a corrections officer. And so just, you know, not a lot of the novel is set in prisons, but that was part of it. I wanted to have Kennedy's creative writing assignments in the novel, because I know that there are a lot of prisoners who are taking classes while they're there and getting their degrees and that sort of thing. And I thought it'd be really interesting to have her voice in the novel as a way to tell her story. So I didn't do a lot of traveling, and now it's COVID time and I can't travel, unfortunately.
And for me, I kind of just like immersed myself in noir fiction and fiction and film. And I'm kind of on a streak here, and I haven't mentioned it yet tonight, but I watched the movie Body Heat like almost weekly when I was writing this movie. Like or writing this book. Oh my gosh, yes! The Body Heat tour. So I love it.
I knew that Halley was going to mention Body Heat at some point, and I found this in my collection, and I got it for $1 at a church rummage sale.
$1 well spent.
A church rummage sale, and it's like the steamiest, tawdriest film. I would not expect to find it in a church, but there we go.
Well, they were trying to get rid of it, I guess. So, so I kind of immersed myself in noir. I did some research into like what I call mythological LA. I did kind of like the celebrity homes tours and some of the murder bus tours to kind of get more of a sense of less like the reality of the city and maybe more kind of the way that people mythologize it. And then the other thing I want to mention is that when I was kind of trying to come up with the structure for the blackmail agency, I did find out that there is this business, and I believe it's in China, where women who suspect their husbands of having affairs will hire mistress distractors, where they kind of figure out whatever it is the mistress, what she sees in this man. If she's looking for a boyfriend or she needs a distraction, they basically hire somebody who will distract the mistress to get them to break up the affair. And so that was like this fascinating thing that I had never heard of, and was kind of in some ways became like a jumping off point for the blackmail agency, which is very different, but shares some similar characteristics.
Wow. That's wow.
Right? Who knew?
So Michelle says, thanks. She adores noir as well. So what has since you mentioned kind of COVID and not being able to travel, what has kind of the last couple of months been like for y'all in terms of writing as you're starting to work on your next projects? Is it something that you've been able to sit down and concentrate on, or is it something that's been hard? Let's start with Halley this time.
I would say it's been hard for me to find the mental space in my own head to sink into my new project the way that I would really like to, which is a shame because I think it would be a great distraction to have. And I'm kind of slowly picking up steam for that again. So I am working on a second novel, but it has been difficult, and it's been weird to launch actually it hasn't been weird. I don't know what launching my debut novel in the middle of a pandemic. I'm like, maybe this is what it's always like. I don't know. But so it's been an experience.
It's not like this. No. I mean,
Good to know.
It's awesome that we get to come to Texas, without getting on a plane.
True.
That's super cool. It's awesome that I get to see Halley and she's in LA and I'm in Brooklyn. But yeah, it's so different. I've been also trying to work on a novel with not making anywhere near as much progress as I want. I'm a mom and I have a child with autism and he takes a lot of attention. And especially now that he's not in school full time, he's back 2 days, which is amazing. For him, it's really important to actually be in school because it's more like therapy than school. But one of the things that I've been doing is working on podcasts with my partner. So my partner, Brian, and I adapted my other novel, The Blondes, and did a fictional podcast and cast it with actors from LA. He went out to LA and recorded Madeline Zima and Rob Belushi and Helen Hong, and they acted it out, and then it got translated into French actually, and so it's in France on this podcast network called Sibel. We did all that before COVID hit, thank God. But now, because we did that, we're like, okay, well, could we write another podcast right now? Because writing with two people is like, you can pass it back and forth. So you don't have to be in the zone all the time, right? And also we can write out loud, like we'll just be walking around talking, or we'll talk out a scene or something like that. And so that's been something that's been a lot of fun during COVID, is he and I are working on it's like a female werewolf pack for our next, I don't know if I'm allowed to reveal that, but that's our next podcast that we're working on together.
That's awesome.
And so,
I will listen to that.
Yeah, definitely. And so on the flip side of that, Danielle wants to know, what is your writing process normally like when there's not a pandemic happening? Do you have any special routines or rituals? Start with Emily.
I don't have a lot of rituals. I drink way too much coffee. I sit down and I don't get up again for as many hours as I can stand it. Like when I'm doing good writing, it's like I'm just like, I'm in, you know what I mean? And I stay in as long as possible. And so like hours can go by if someone brings me food, basically. And that falls to Brian. Thank you, Brian. Brian also, set up my microphone tonight and my light. But in terms of superstition, there was one thing that I was doing last year, and sadly I didn't wear my earrings, but I have these knife earrings and they look a lot like the knives on the cover of the book. And
Awesome.
when I was working on my new novel, because I knew I had this one coming out and it had this knife imagery, I would put on my knife earrings, and that was like, okay, I'm gonna write gonna write a thriller now.
That's awesome. For me, it is such an optimistic question that there's a ritual. Definitely just a lot of caffeine also. And then one thing that I do that I think has been really helpful for the lady upstairs, was I built this playlist that kind of helped me immediately tap into like Jo as a character. And it was a lot of stuff that was kind of evocative of noirish type music. And I'm working on doing that for the new book too. But I think things like that can really help you like transform your headspace a little bit, which is so important.
Yeah, I would agree. I put a playlist up on my Instagram, and it's got all the 90s songs that are referenced in the book. So,
Awesome.
Yeah.
And can we talk a little bit about kind of titles and covers? Did you guys, is this a title that you had? Did you go through different titles? Let's start with Halley.
So funny enough, The Lady Upstairs is actually the title that I had for the book in grad school. Was the only real title I ever had for the book. And I was not necessarily totally committed to it, but I couldn't think of anything that was better. And then it just started to grow on me. And so when we sold my book to Putnam, that was actually an early note from my editor, Danielle, she said, we're going to talk to sales and we'll see if maybe there's a better title we can come up with. And I was like, I'm open to that. And then she came back like 3 weeks later and was like, no, the more we think about it, the more we like it, which was funny because that's the exact experience I had. So that was cool. And then the other thing is this cover, which I'm absolutely in love with, was designed by Erica Verbeck. And we didn't change much from when she originally sent it. And I just felt so thrilled to be so in love so quickly with the cover, and just like burst into tears the second I saw it, and I'm thrilled and want it. I have it up in my home, like on a big poster, like a skeevy 70s movie producer. So.
And with my book, it was not called Little Threats. It was called The Ordinary Form of Girlhood when I submitted it, which is really abstract, and it's a reference to Jane Eyre. And it went into Danielle, and she was kind of like, well, I really like this book, but we may talk about changing that title. And I mean, I wasn't entirely 100% behind it because it had the word girlhood. And I feel like, you know, girl has been out there for a while. There've been articles about the numerous books with girl in the title. So we started kicking around titles. We came up with a bunch of titles that were from 90s songs that we thought might fit, and a couple of things that were just lines from the book. And then Little Threats was just, I don't know what happened. I was thinking about what is the book about and who are the girls, and I was thinking how their sexuality in some ways is threatening, you know, to the men in the book. And I was also thinking about there are these little, a lot of the reveals in the book are from ephemera, and they're little things like little necklaces, little notes. And I was just thinking also about the diminutive nature of the word little, you know what I mean? That they're little girls in some ways, you know what I mean? And so that's how Little Threats came about. I kind of just like, you know, she liked it, I liked it, and it stuck. And I also love my cover, and it's
beautiful.
Tal Goretsky, and I think he put all this together. I think these were separate images that he designed and put together. So
beautiful.
And so Michelle wanted to know then, how involved were you guys with the actual cover art? Did you give, I know sometimes publishers will reach out and say, how do you envision this? Or did the publishers just send you something to see how you liked it? Let's go with Emily first.
Okay. So Danielle, my editor, and I talked about just images and symbols in the book. And so we talked about different things. We talked about boots, you know, like Doc Martens, you know, we talked about the girls' necklaces, you know, the fashion choices. We didn't know how that would play. We talked about sisters and twins and how you convey that. And then I'm not sure how this came about, but I really liked the fact that it's like a hand-ripped knife. It looks like, you know, it looks like something you cut out. And, you know, the handwriting I thought was very personal, the same way the girls have handwritten notes. And so, you know, they sent it to me, and I just was like, I love it, which doesn't always happen. I mean, this is not my first novel, and I can tell you that doesn't always happen. So.
For me, it was very much the same. Danielle and I talked about things I liked and didn't like in covers. And one thing that I really kind of love about this cover is that it feels very modern, but I also kind of love that the neon feels like a throwback to those kind of like 80s, 90s Edna Buchanan crime books, crime novels. And so to me, it kind of did the perfect work of straddling, you know, this kind of throwbacky feel in the book and also something more modern. And very similar, I actually had a lot of fear about the day that I got the cover email, because I was like, oh, what if I hate it? And then I opened it and I just was like totally in love.
Awesome. So one more question before we go. I always hate to ask people this question because you guys both either have just had a book come out like a day ago, or you have a book coming out in a week, and we're celebrating that. But everybody always wants to know, what are you working on next? Let's start with Halley.
Okay. I am working on another feminist thriller set in Los Angeles, and it's very early days of it yet. So I'll just give kind of a brief overview, and I guess my agent can tell me later if I shouldn't do this, but we're doing it. And it's about a woman who's a former child starlet and is now running a murder bus tour in Los Angeles, and on one of her stops discovers a dead body. And so gets kind of roped into the investigation there. That also ties into the unsolved murder of her sister 20 years before.
That's a solid elevator pitch, remember?
Yeah, I'm not that honed on this one yet. So I'm working on something called The Remembering Party, and it's about a woman who's had an accident, or possibly someone hurt her. We'll find out. And she's lost her memory, and she's only able to recover her memories through things like films. She's mixing up films and her life, and her friends have decided to have a party for her to try to bring back her memories and piece together what might have happened.
Oh, that sounds so good.
Well, thank you so much for both of you for joining us tonight. Before we head out, let me just remind everybody, again, if you missed the first part of this because of YouTube being down, we'll get it uploaded as soon as YouTube starts cooperating, and we'll make sure to tag authors, publisher, everybody, so you guys will know when it's up, and I'll also send the link to Publicist so we can get that spread out to everybody. We have copies of Little Threats in store now by Emily Schultz, and we will have The Lady Upstairs by Halley Sutton next Tuesday when it is released. If you guys are local to us, Murdered by the Book is open open again. You don't need an appointment. You can just wander in. We're here or at the store 10 to 6 Monday through Saturday. And if you're still not comfortable coming in, we completely understand that. We're still reachable by phone. We're still doing curbside pickup and online stuff. Halley and Emily, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Y'all take care, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.